guess I taught for that week, whether it be the Haftorah, whether it be the Gemara that he was teaching, and he taught many Gemaras even at the same time. He had what I call the magic touch. He would always find a chidush, some insight into whatever he was studying. And therefore it's impossible. You'd have to fill up an entire library with his insights, with his chidush. So what I tried to do for tonight was to focus on the area of his public lectures, his drushos, and his writings, his essays. And we'll have to leave out, to some extent, what I consider the main part of his contribution, and that is his lumdus, his insights into sugyas. But my contention is that the methodology that Rav Soloveitchik used and applied to lumdus was also, from his perspective, the same way of thinking, the same methodology that he applied to all hashkafa issues, to attitudes, to contemporary life. So we will get to touch Yirtzeh Hashem on his methodology as we go along. I want to begin with the following observation, something that he said over and over again. And that is that principles of faith and philosophy and metaphysics are only important because they give us a way of life. Our challenge is to take these concepts, these prepositions, these definitions of God and his universe and transform them, convert them into moral principles. And I'd like to give a few examples of how this works. First of all, we say that God created the universe, yesh me'ayin ex nihilo. No one can really comprehend ex nihilo. How do you create something out of nothing? We live in a physical world of science, of cause and effect, a natural world. And this concept of ex nihilo, God as creator, is something that defies human comprehension. There's no way we can explain it philosophically. But the challenge is to convert the concept of creation into a moral challenge for each and every one of us. The Torah tells us, "V'halachta b'drachav," otherwise known as imitatio Deo. We have to imitate God. And if God is a creator, then we are called upon to be creators. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But beyond that, the basic principle of Jewish morality comes from creation. And why is that so? David HaMelech says in Tehillim, "Lashem ha'aretz u'muloah, tevel v'yoshvei bo." The entire universe is Lashem. Lashem means God possesses, he owns everything. It's all his. And why? The pasuk continues, "Ki hu al yamim yisoda, v'al naharos yichonenah," because he created the world. And this reflects a principle in halacha, in Jewish law, which is reflected in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, and that is called Kinyon Maisi Yodayim. Here's the case. I bring raw materials to an artisan. He shapes it, he forms it, he creates a final product. I gave him the raw materials, which were mine, but he, through his own creation, what we call Maisi Yodayim, he now returns to me an object which is worth multiple times more than the original raw materials. But before he gives me the object back, who owns this object? And the Gemara quotes two opinions. One opinion says, Uman Kona B'Shvach Keli, that the artisan possesses that which he created because it's his creation. A new kinyan, a new method of acquiring ownership. It's mine, I created it, and therefore I own it. The other man, the Yom says, no. Ein Uman Kona B'Shvach Keli, because there's nothing substantially. He just changed and reshaped the raw materials, and therefore it doesn't belong to him. But when it comes to ex nihilo, everybody agrees. There's no machlokas. As we say in the Gemara language, kuliyavel hopligi, it's unanimous that uman kona b'shvach keli, that man, and in this case God, creates something and he owns that which he created, because no one's giving God the raw materials. It's a product of ex nihilo, of yesh me'ayin. If there's no raw materials to begin with, God creates something, then it's his by virtue of the principle of uman kona b'shvach keli. This is a tremendous moral axiom which really forms the backbone of all of Jewish morality. Everything that we think we own, we really don't own. Maybe it's on loan, but it really belongs to Hashem, because Hashem ha'aretz u'maloah. Everything belongs to him. It's fascinating that in the Ne'ilah service, which is perhaps the apex of all our davening on Yom Kippur, if you take a look, there's one phrase that repeats itself twice. There's no vidui. We don't go into the long enumeration of sin, but we say, Laman yechtal be'oshek yadeinu. What does oshek yadeinu mean? We have to desist from thievery, from stealing. What's that all about? Why is it that in the holiest day of the year, and the apex of all our prayers, we're going to recite confession for the sin of robbery? Who robbed anything? You know, we have X number of people davening in a shul on Rosh Hashanah. Look around. I don't see any thieves there in the audience. I mean, I hope not. But the answer is that whenever we misuse, whenever we abuse any talents, any thoughts, any part of our body, we are stealing from Hashem. This is an embezzlement. This is called me'ilah. Why is it called me'ilah? The concept of me'ilah means when I steal something from Hegdesh, something that's sanctified. Why is it that whenever I take something from this world without having rights to do so, whenever I violate the will of God, chas v'sholom, I'm considered oshek yadeinu, as if I stole something. And from what? From whom did I steal it? From Hegdesh. Why? Because Lashem ha'aretz u'maloah. The word Lashem in halacha means Hegdesh. Let's say, for example, I own this table and I want to sanctify it for Hegdesh, and now I transfer ownership over to Hegdesh. I say Lashem Shulchan Zeh, Lashem Karma. Everything in this universe belongs to God. It's all his. And if we misuse it, if we take it for our own benefits when we're not licensed to do so, we are guilty of thievery, of robbery, of oshek. All sin really comes down to one sin, and that is oshek. And therefore, for example, the Gemara says in brachos, if I want to enjoy the benefit of a food, then I have to recite a bracha. If I don't recite a birchas hamenu, then I'm a moel. I have taken something from Hegdesh, because God owns everything. And when we say God owns everything, we mean literally everything. Our thoughts, our talents, our energies, our speech, everything belongs to the Almighty God. This is the fundamental principle of Jewish morality. And it all begins with the philosophical concept of God creating the universe, yesh me'ayin. But there's another moral principle that I indicated before. And once again, we're taking a fundamental principle of faith and converting it into a moral principle. And that is that man is called upon to imitate God. And if God is a creator, then man has to be a creator. How does man become a creator? So one of Rav Soloveitchik's famous essays is called Halachic Man, Ish Halacha. And if I had to pinpoint the central theme, there are many themes to that essay, but the most prominent theme is man as a creator. When a person sits down and studies Torah, he becomes a creator. In his own way, in a very unique, individual way, he understands that sugya. And it's a chidush. He's creative. We are not meant to just recite the Torah by rote, just read it on a superficial level. We delve deep into it. And with profound insights, we become creators. We now have imitated God as a creator. The Medrash tells us, in the name of Rabbi Avo, at the beginning of Chumash, that God, listen carefully, bara olamos v'chrivan. He created many worlds. The world that we're looking at is not the only world that God created, and God destroyed these worlds. I have one question. I don't know why this was the best of all the experiments, but that's a different issue. What am I meant to learn? What moral principle do I derive? What responsibility can be placed on my shoulders when I learn, Rabbi Avo, that God created many worlds, multiple worlds, and destroyed them until he finally created this world? And to give you a dramatic answer to that question, we'll take Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is known, of course, as the eternal optimist. In the later part of his life, as you and I know, he lost 24,000 Talmidim. Who could even imagine what a catastrophe, what mourning and grief Rabbi Akiva went through when his life's work had come to a termination? But Rabbi Akiva pushed on. He didn't throw up his hands and give up hope. He started teaching Torah and raising a new generation. And he had 5 Talmidim from which the Torah was able to exist. Every one of us experiences in our lives losses, defeats, and what is our response? We have to be like God. Even if we have to be machriv, we have to give up on different enterprises and projects that were so important to us. Nevertheless, we have to start all over again with a new sense of energy, learning from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to imitate God who created many worlds. In the story of creation, the Torah tells us, for Aretz Haisa So Vavo, there was chaos. Why is it important for you and I to know this? It's such a metaphysical principle about chaos, about Tov Vavo, about void. But the answer is, again, to translate this into a moral responsibility. We are responsible to banish and overcome all of Tov Vavo in this universe. And that means that we have to create a civilization. We have to create technology. If we need bridges to cross rivers and oceans, that's what we have to do. And perhaps most important, we have to educate. The mind and the spirit of a young child is Tov Vavo. It really is chaos. It has no structure. But when we teach a child, we form him or her, and we are in effect taking Tov Vavo and making it into something of structure, something of purpose. That's the responsibility. So man has to conquer disease. He has to control rivers. He has to heal the sick. He has to alleviate suffering. All this is man's challenge to overcome Tov Vavo and be creative. And if you look at Jewish history, all of Jewish history is a repetition of this same process over and over again. We built a community in Babylonia, and then we were sent into exile. And we restructured, and we went to Spain, and we were expelled from Spain. We got to Poland, we got to Germany. And each time the Jewish people, suffering the losses and the expulsions that they did, they came back and recreated a Jewish society, a Jewish community. That's making something creative out of Tov Vavo. As I said at the outset, what's fascinating about studying the attitudes, the hashkafot, the philosophies of Rav Soloveitchik is that he utilizes the Lumdish terminology, the methodology of Lumdis, to analyze Sukkos and Shas, and he applies them here in the area of hashkafah. And anyone who knows anything about the Soloveitchik dynasty, and we're going back now to Rav Soloveitchik's grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker, it's all about Tzvei Dinim, two different laws. You take a law and you break it down into its component parts. You talk about two dimensions. You talk about comparing two concepts and showing the contrast between them. They seem similar on the surface, but they're fundamentally different. This is the essence of the Derech HaLimud, the methodology of Brisk, of Reb Chaim. And Rav Soloveitchik took this structure, this methodology, and he applied it over and over again to the areas of Jewish thought and Jewish ethics. Let me mention a few examples. In the Torah, there are two words that sound identical. Eda and Machaneh. And Rav Soloveitchik told us over and over again that they're fundamentally different. A Machaneh is formed when a community is made up of individuals, all of whom have a common enemy. So they gather together for practical reasons, for self-defense. That's a Machaneh. Eda is a whole different concept. Eda means a community, the members of which have a common metaphysical goal. They have ideals, they have beliefs, they have a spiritual agenda. And that the word Eda comes from the word Eid, which means testimony. And there's a testimony, an Eidus, like the Luchos Eidus. And we are all together dedicated to work towards the goal of that Eda. Another example, the Gemara tells us in Masechta Megillah, Mevatlim Talmud Torah Lebikra Megillah. For example, I have a chavrusa at a certain time, but it's time to hear the Megillah. So the Gemara tells me I have to be mevatel my Torah, stop learning, for the sake of hearing the Megillah. But the question is obvious. Why is that called Bittul Torah? Megillas Esther is one of the 24 books of the Kisvei HaKodesh. It's also Torah. So when I read the Megillah, when I hear the Megillah, I am fulfilling a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Why is this called Bittul Talmud Torah? But the answer is that Talmud Torah can be studied on two different levels. There's one level of reading Torah Shabbat. I may or may not understand what I'm reading, but it's meaningful. And Torah Shabbat incorporates all the books of Kisvei HaKodesh. A man reads Tehillim. He doesn't understand a word of what he's reading. He's Mekayim a mitzvah because Tehillim is Torah Shabbat. But then there's another level of learning, of study. That's called Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh requires study, requires understanding. It's not Kriya, it's Havana. If I don't understand what I'm reading, if I read a Mishnah, it's meaningless. To read a Mishnah without understanding it is Torah Shebal Peh. It doesn't have a kiyum. Mevatlim Talmud Torah means that since there are different levels, there's a hierarchy of Talmud Torah. When you read the Megillah, yes, for sure you get a kiyum of Talmud Torah. You fulfill that mitzvah. But it's on one level. And vis-a-vis a higher level, when you could be learning a sugya with your chavrus and plunging to the depths of that sugya, then you are mavatal that level of Talmud Torah. Rav Soloveitchik is very famous for an essay which is called The Lonely Man of Faith. How many people in the audience, by the way, have ever heard of the book called The Lonely Man of Faith? Okay, I see. Okay, that's not too bad. I was hoping more hands would go up. But in any event, in The Lonely Man of Faith, the structure of which is an analysis of two chapters at the beginning of Sefer Bereishis, Bereishis Aleph and Bereishis Beis, two different descriptions of the creation of man and Eve, of Adam and Chava. Rav Soloveitchik develops an entire structure called Adam the First and Adam the Second. And once again, you will see the manifestation and the application of the Brisker methodology in Adam the First and Adam the Second. It's a tzvei dinim, if you will. Two dimensions of man, two types of relationships between man and fellow man, between man and his wife and her husband. And on one level, on a more superficial level, Adam the First gathers together with Chava, with his wife, on a level of let's be partners, let's work towards a common goal. But on a deeper level, which is Adam the Second, we're talking about a more profound metaphysical relationship that touches on the infinite of two people that enter into a brisk relationship together, a covenant, They become one. Another example of these two different levels, the superficial level and the deeper level. In one of Rav Soloveitchik's discussions with us during a siyum, when we finished a certain parak, he spoke about two relationships between a Rav and his Talmud. On one level, the Rav is teaching the Talmud information. He's pumping as much information as he can into the mind of his Talmud. But the Rebbi and the Talmud remain two separate entities, two separate personalities, independent one of the other. On a more profound level, the Rebbi and the Talmud merge into one personality. The I awareness, to use a term from existential philosophy, if you heard of Martin Buber and so forth, the I awareness of the Rebbe includes the Talmud and vice versa. It's like they become one, they become united. Rav Soloveitchik spoke about the sanctity of every Jew on two different levels. Again, an application of Tzvei Dinah. There's one Kedusha which is called Kedushas HaAvos. I'll explain. Another Kedusha is Kedusha Atzmis. The Torah tells us in Parshas Re'eh that God chooses us as a nation, and then it says, B'cha B'char Hashem. Rashi says that the beginning of the pasuk refers to Kedusha Sheyarashta Min HaAvos, the sanctity of every Jew that he inherits from our forefathers. And there Rashi says, U'B'cha B'char Hashem. Rashi says, Kedushas Atzma. This is your own private, personal Kedusha. On the one hand, every Jew, insofar as he's a Jew, inherits that sanctity as being part of the Kedushas HaAvos. And even a ger, a convert, enters into that bris of Kedushas HaAvos because Avram Avinu is the father of Gerim. But then there's another level. Don't let a person sit back on his laurels and say, well, I have the sanctity and I'm uplifted as a member of the Jewish community because I am an offspring, a descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. No. There's another level of Kedusha, and that's very subjective. It depends on each individual. That's Kedushas Atzmacha. And the more a person works in a profound way to elevate himself, to study Torah on the deepest level, he now creates a new level of Kedusha for himself. That's Kedushas Atzmacha. That's his own private Kedusha. You know, we have two brachos that we recite in the morning in the Birchas HaShachar that sound almost identical. One is Gvura, right? Also Yisrael Gvura. And the other is Koach. No saying Vayoif Koach. Both Gvura and Koach in the English translation might be identical synonyms. Rav Soloveitchik said absolutely not. Koach is on the physical level. We are tired. We are fatigued. We wake up in the morning sometimes. We didn't have enough sleep the night before. And we ask Hashem and we praise Hashem. No saying Layoiv Koach. That's physical power. But on a deeper level, it's Ozer Yisrael B'Gvura. Gvura is a metaphysical quality of man that gives an individual an ability to overcome temptations, challenges, to surmount all the boundaries and impediments of life. That's Gvura on a much more profound level. Rav Soloveitchik in his public lectures very often would tirade against those who would use common sense to understand the Torah and the halach of the Jewish law. He would always insist that Jewish law has logic, it's logical, but it has a logical system of its own, not to be identified with secular Western logic. So you can take a course today in almost any university in logic. It's mostly mathematical symbols. And you can be an expert in logic. But that doesn't mean that you'll understand the logic of the Torah. The logic of the Torah is very unique, and it's a self-contained, independent system. For example, a Kal Vachomer. We think a Kal Vachomer is just very simple and logical, but a Kal Vachomer has to fit into many, many different rules and regulations. throughout Jewish history, unfortunately, there were Jews who didn't get the message. They didn't understand and appreciate that halacha and Jewish law operates with its own methodology, its own logical system. And perhaps the most profound example of that in the Torah itself is Korach. Rav Soloveitchik used to call Korach the common sense rebellion. After all, Korach had arguments, and all his arguments were built on common sense. If one string of tcheles would patter up an entire garment for tzitzis, then why, if you have a garment full of tcheles, and the entire garment is made of tcheles, why do I have to add another string, and so forth and so on, mezuzah, and all the different logical arguments they put forward? But what Korach failed to recognize, he did not acknowledge the unique logic of the Torah of halacha. He was applying common sense logic. And this is something that we've suffered from throughout the generations, all the different movements that rose up against traditional Judaism. It was all based on this rebellion of Korach, of the common sense rebellion. What is our relationship to Goyim, to the non-Jewish community? I have here in front of me a wonderful book, which is called Reflections of the Rav, and it was compiled by Rabbi Berzon Olav Shalom. He has 2 volumes. This is the first volume. And he quotes Rav Soloveitchik, who tries to understand Avram Avinu's statement at the beginning of Parshas Chayesara, Ger v'toshav anochi mochem. Ger is a stranger. Toshav is a citizen, a local person who lives in that community. Avram Avinu is saying something and the opposite. He's describing himself on the one hand as a ger, and on the other hand as a toshav. Well, what is it? Let's have it. Are you a ger or a toshav? And once again, using the methodology of Tzvei Binim of 2 dimensions, there are 2 dimensions, that relationship to the non-Jewish world. On the one hand, we are a toshav. We live in the community that we live in, wherever it is on the face of the globe, and we are upstanding citizens. The Gemara tells us, Dina d'Balchus Dina. We are obliged to follow the law of the land. Not only that, the Gemara tells us, having a mission of us, having mispalel b'shlomo shel malchus. We have to pray on behalf of the welfare of the state. A Jew has to understand and appreciate, says Rav Soloveitchik, that he is part of mankind. He is part of the human race. And as such, he must bear that responsibility and share that burden of contributing to the welfare of the state. But on the other hand, a Jew is always a ger. He has his own commitments. He is part of a nation of bris. He has visions. When Rothschild died in France, anyone who knows the first thing about France will tell you it's a very nationalistic country. And Rothschild was known in the highest circles of political echelon when Charles de Gaulle was the premier of France. And he left a tzava, a last will and testament that his remains should be brought to Israel and buried there. And de Gaulle made the following statement: I thought Rothschild was a loyal citizen of France. As if to say that because he wanted to be buried in Israel, therefore he's not a loyal Frenchman. A Frenchman has to be buried in France. And Rav Soloveitchik would always warn us to be very careful about the influence of the Goyim in the society that we find ourselves in. Yes, we will walk together with them. We will help contribute to conquer all the difficulties and the diseases. And we have made contributions, unbelievable, the Jewish contributions to every society throughout the Jewish long, bitter, godless exile. But we can walk hand in hand with the Goyim in the political echelon up until a certain point. When they manifest immorality, when they are intolerant, when they are cruel, when they violate Jewish morality, at that point, we part ways. And with regard to the issue, I don't know if you remember this, called ecumenism, when they wanted to invite the Jewish leaders, to join in their study of joint, the common religion that connects the 2 great religions. Rav Soloveitchik was very cold to that idea. He was unexcited about it. He wrote a letter to the Pope. By the way, if you're writing a letter to the Pope, what language should you write it in? The Rav wrote a 90-page letter to the Pope. In what language? Latin. The Pope didn't know Latin. He had to have somebody translate the letter for him. The essence of the letter was that we have our own religion. We can be common with the non-Jews in certain secular, contribute, agendas and enterprises and goals. But when it comes to religion, we have our own religious Weltanschauung. I know there's a young man here from Boston, so he'll no doubt confirm what I say. The Rav was a patriarch. I remember a shir that he gave us. I still remember the name of the sugya, Cheskes Habatim, Soda Zu and Soda Stam. The Rav couldn't figure out pshat. Hour after hour after hour after hour, 4 hours and a half. We're sitting there. The Rav is racking his brains, trying to figure out pshat for 4.5 hours. The only problem is it was Thanksgiving. So when the Rav finally threw in the towel, he says, all right, go home and eat your turkey. The Rav was very proud of America. I'm not sure what he would say today, but he was very proud of America. By the way, this is off the records. He voted. Anybody know what it was known? All the Jews voted Democrat. Not all. The Rav voted Republican. Anyway, that's another discussion. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the Rav's attitude towards women in general, the Jewish woman, Talmud Torah for women. He has a beautiful eulogy for his Mechutenista, the Tolner Rebbitzin. It's a masterpiece. It's one of the only svarim I couldn't bring in tonight because I couldn't find it. But he speaks about the Jewish woman. And in the context of this eulogy, he talks about his own mother, Pesha, and his father, Moshe. And he says the following. I'll give you an example of what he called Torah Simecha. This Torah Savicha and that tradition and that Masorah that's transmitted from father to son. And then his Torah Simecha. The tradition that has to be transmitted from a mother to her children. And he gave the example of Shabbos. And he said, if I want to know anything about Shabbos, if I want to understand any malach, there are 39 categories of labor with intensely complicated nuances of halachas, I have to ask my father. My father will tell me and enlighten me about the details of how to observe the Shabbos. But if I want to experience the Shabbos, if I want to feel uplifted by the spirit of Shabbos, that I get from my mother, he said. And he applied this to the Tolner Rebbe. I remember when he spoke about Chai Sorah and he spoke about Sorah Imenu, he pointed out that Sorah Imenu was the paradigm of a Jewish mother. And she connected and integrated so many different elements. She had the youth of prayer. We know the young people, and especially very young people, are able to pray. And in that sense, she was like a 7-year-old. She had the beauty of a 20-year-old and the wisdom of a 100-year-old. She combined and integrated everything that makes up a Jewish woman. And Rav Soloveitchik took a strong stand about teaching Torah to women when it wasn't popular, to allow and encourage women to study Torah Shemal Peh. Very controversial issue. The Rav used to say, I can't understand that women are studying secular knowledge on a graduate level, on a postgraduate level, and they don't know anything about a piece of Gemara? How could that be? And the Rav personally molded a high school in Boston, everybody knows this, from Maimonides, in which they taught Gemara to the women. Rav Soloveitchik has a central concept in his hashkafa, in his worldview, that he repeats over and over again, especially in Sefer Bereishis. and that is the Covenantal Community. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's very famous for those who are familiar, even from a distance, to Rav Soloveitchik's insights. The Covenantal Community requires a commitment. On the one hand, the Almighty entering into this covenant, into this bris, makes a commitment. The commitment is that God will protect the Jewish people. That ultimately there will be a redemption. But in a bris, in a covenant, like in any contractual agreement, there has to be a commitment on both sides. And we, the Jewish people, are committed through the covenantal community to raise our children, to follow in the path of their fathers and their grandfathers. Rav Soloveitchik used to always point out that we are called B'nai Yisrael. Yisrael is the third of the Avos, Yaakov Avinu. Why are we called the name of Yaakov? And he would point out that Yaakov was the only one of the three Avos who taught Torah to his grandchildren, to Ephraim and Menashe. We don't know that Avraham Avinu sat and learned to block Gemara with Yaakov Avinu, but we do know that the children of Yosef in Mitzrayim were disciples of their grandfather Yaakov. And this is what Knesset Yisrael is all about. Our secret weapon is the transmission of Torah, what we call the Mesorah of Torah. In Brisk, in Soloveitchik family, that whole sky, everything is about the Mesorah. When you transmitted Torah from your Rebbi, from your father, from your grandfather, it had to be transmitted exactly the way you heard it. They say about Rabbi Baruch Ber Leibovich, who was a Talmud Muvak of Reb Chaim, that when he would say over the Shia that he heard from his Rebbe Reb Chaim, he would pull up his pants exactly where Reb Chaim pulled up his pants. It's a little embarrassing to say this, but that was the Mesorah. You know, you had to imitate your Rebbe. I remember the Rav said that according to the Ramban, Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas tzibur. It's an obligation incumbent on the entire community. It's not a chovas yachid on me, but rather on the community. And then he would add that Reb Chaim disagreed, and Reb Chaim held that Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas yachid. And the Rav, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, Reb Chaim, would insist that when he landed in Boston, they landed from Boston to New York, that they would read the Torah for him. And we got together a minyan because he was in transit, he couldn't hear the Torah. So somebody asked the Rav, where is this Ramban? How do I find the Ramban? So the Rav said, listen carefully, I'll say it the way he would say it, we don't know where the Ramban is. He heard this Ramban from Reb Chaim or from his father Reb Moshe, and we don't know where the Ramban is. So Rabbi Blau told me, I don't know if you know Rabbi Yosef Blau, that he found the Ramban. And he waited until the Rav would get back to the sugya. He had to wait a few years. When the Rav came back to the sugya, the Rav said, we don't know where the Ramban is. So Rabbi Blau opens up the Gemara Megillah to the Rif, and he was too scared to say anything, but he just pushed it in front of the Rav. So the Rav closed the Gemara. He says, we don't know where the Ramban is.
What's the point?
It's part of a Mesorah. But what am I trying to convey to you? This commitment and loyalty to the Mesorah. I don't know, Aaron, is there, if I would shut off my phone, then everything dies, right? Okay, so because it keeps ringing. I don't know. Anyway. So what can I tell you about the Mesorah? Let me say a few things that Rav Soloveitchik used to teach us, and he used to try to, knock it into our brains. We have, in every Masechta, many debates between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Who do we paskin like? In a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, like Beis Hillel, correct? Now, once we paskin like Beis Hillel, we reject Beit Shammai. In fact, the Lashon of Chazal is, Mishnah's Beit Shammai and some Beis Hillel ain't a Mishnah. So what happens when I'm studying a sugya And I'm delving and working hard with tremendous effort to understand both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Does it mean, heaven forbid, that when I'm studying Beit Shammai, I'm not learning Torah? So the Rav said that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. There's what's called a Chefza Shel Torah, and there's a Chovas Gam. This is a classic Brisker love. This is the difference between the object and the subject, which is so basic to any philosophical system. When you're talking about a Chovas Gavra within the context of Talmud Torah, I have to open up a Shulchan Aruch and I have to figure out what are my responsibilities as a Jew. And here I will find the Shita of Beis Hillel. However, as far as the entity of Torah, as a Chefza Shel Torah, Beit Shammai is no less a Chefza Shel Torah than Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai, with their view, create a Chefza Shel Torah. This is called Elu v'Elu Dibur L'Kim Chayim. And the Rav went very far with this. He said that what happens in a case of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan or an Issa d'Rabbanan, this is a rabbinic enactment. Would somebody argue that if I study Masechta Shabbos, I get a Kiyum D'Oraisa of Talmud Torah, V'shinanta L'vanecha. But if I study Masechta Megillah or Masechta Tainis that we're studying now in the Daf Yomi, then it's only d'Rabbanan. Said the Rav, no. The d'Rabbanan create a Chefza Shel Torah. And that's why we said before that although a woman is technically exempt from the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, we derive this from the Pasuk of Vanecha, but nevertheless, a woman could create a Chefza Shel Torah. So let's say, for example, a woman would, heaven forbid, want to think Torah thoughts in a bathhouse. That would be prohibited because you can't have a Chefza Shel Torah in a bathhouse.
Can you explain a little more what you Chefza Shel Torah?
Right? You have to be really oriented in these terms. Chefza Shel Torah means this is an entity. You don't see it with your eyes because it's not material. It's not like this table, which could be a Chefza Shel Shulchan, but there's some entity there called Chefza Torah. We use the term Chefza Shel Torah to differentiate between the Gabra, the personality, and the Chefza. It could be that the personality, person, like I gave you the example of a woman or an Eved, that person is exempt personally from the obligation to study Torah. But if that person opts voluntarily to study Torah, they create an entity of Torah. And that entity of Torah has certain dinim to it. It can't be brought into a bathhouse, for example. You can't, or tefillah, for example. You can have a chefza shel tefillah. It could be that I'm not obligated in prayer, but I can create voluntarily a chefza shel prayer. So therefore, you would not be allowed to walk in front of me within Dalet Amos because you are disturbing a chefza shel tefillah. I don't know if I made myself clear. A person could actually transform himself into a chefza shel Torah. That's very fascinating. And I'll give you the context that I wanted to mention. Rav Soloveitchik gave a very famous eulogy for his uncle, the brisker Rav, Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Halevi Soloveitchik. It's called Madodech Midot, and it's published. There are a few things about that hesped that are very interesting, but we won't go into it now. In that hesped, he spoke about the pasuk, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Morasha kihilas Yaakov. Moshe gave us the Torah, and the Torah is a morasha, it's a heritage for the entire community of Israel. And the Gemara tells us, Al tikri morasha ella me'urasa. Now here let me just say a few words about Jewish halachic marriage. Halachic marriage, as you know, takes place in two stages. The first stage is called Erusin, in which case she still lives in her father's house. And then there's something called Nisuin, where he takes her into his house, into the chuppah, which represents his house. And that's a more profound level of a marriage relationship. At that point, we say, V'hayu l'basar echad, they become one. But as long as it's only Erusin, that's a marriage relationship. Our status is that of an Ish, but nevertheless, it's only in Hilchas Kinyanim. They are separate entities and separate identities. He lives in his house and she lives in our father's house. And Rav Soloveitchik says that within the context of one's relationship to Torah, there could be two different levels of that relationship. There could be Erusin on the basic level, and then there's the Su'id. In Erusin, a man studies Torah, and he may have acquired a tremendous wealth of Torah knowledge. He can pass any exam, but it's only Erusin. He and the Torah still remain two separate entities. But then there's a higher level, a more profound level. As we spoke about before, very often Rav Soloveitchik, in his two dimensions, sees a surface level and a deeper level. On a deeper level, a person who studies Torah can become a Nesuin LeTorah. He can have a full-fledged marriage with Torah, in which case he identifies with Torah. Everything about his personality is Torah. Every thought that he thinks is a Torah thought. And here Rav Soloveitchik went very far. When he described his uncle, the Brisker Rav, as someone who was married to the Torah and had that unique unity with the Torah, he spoke about the following. Let's say you ask a shaila, you ask a question to a rabbi. The Chassam Sofer, who was one of the great giants about 150 years ago, a little bit more, but now, he used to say that when you ask me a question in halacha, I'll give you the answer before I even know logically why that answer is correct. I haven't even seen the sources. I intuitively know that this is the answer to your question. I can pass it for you immediately. And then, afterwards, I'll substantiate my psak by going through the sources, the Megoros. So Rav Soloveitchik asked, how is that possible? The answer is, if you have this Nesuin relationship with Torah, it's not just Erusin, then what you become is the Nishmas HaTorah. You now have the Neshama of the Torah. The Torah is not just made up of hardcore facts and laws. It is a Neshama. It has its own personality. The Rav very often used to cry out that as a Rebbi to his Talmidim in America, he felt that he was able and successful to teach them Torah and to give them a methodology of how to learn Torah, to give them a tremendous amount of knowledge. But he felt, and he was very down about it, that he wasn't able to transmit the neshama of Torah to his Talmud. He used to cry out about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening. Yeah, we know how to daven. We can learn the avodah. We know the Musaf service. And what went on in the Beis HaMikdash, we've learned the Sugyas and Yuma. But do we feel the presence of the Shekhinah? Are we standing in the Beis HaMikdash? Do we experience the neshama of the Torah? And he felt that he had failed to communicate and transmit that neshama of Torah, which is the most profound level of a relationship to Torah. What is the attitude towards death? In the past, we've mentioned, especially, was it 2 weeks ago when we got together before Hanukkah about Rabbi Berzon, that death is just a transition from one world to another world. Nothing to get too upset about. On the contrary, in a sense, Histalkus HaTzadik means that the Tzadik goes even higher after death. Not so in the philosophy of Rav Soloveitchik. And again, if we had time, we would go through this. Rav Soloveitchik points out in Parshas Chukas, which is the sugya of Tumas Mes, when a person defiles himself by coming in contact with a corpse. And Rav Soloveitchik says that the Torah opens up this parsha by saying, Zos Chukas HaTorah. And we make a mistake if we think that Chukah in this context means that we don't understand the mechanism of Tara, of how to be Matar someone and purify him when he's contaminated, and Shlomo Melech's comment and so forth and so on. He says, no, you know what the chok is? The chok here that we can't understand is death itself. And he says about death, it has a contaminating effect. Contact with death disqualifies a person from entering into the Mikdash, from eating kodshim, from participating in other matters of holiness. Death is a mocking fate that awaits us, a trauma of human helplessness, which disturbs our existential serenity, is an absurdity, which undoes all of man's rational planning, his dreams, his hopes. And we wonder why should the foremost of God's creations, meaning man, have an awareness of his mortality, living, as it were, in constant dread and distress in the face of its inevitability. And in his writings about halachic man, which I have here in front of me, he says that halachic man was allergic to visiting cemeteries. He says about a whole slew, he has a whole list of gedolim, of great giants, who would never visit a cemetery unless they absolutely had to for the purpose of burying the dead. Why is that so? Because when a person visits a cemetery, even if he's not a Kohen, he contaminates himself. Death and facing death is something that brings a person down. And in this context, I want to talk to you about Rav Soloveitchik's attitude towards the Musar movement that we spoke about in our first lecture when we spoke about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael tried very hard to introduce the Musar agenda into the great yeshiva of Valozhin. And keep in mind that in the mid-19th century, the greatest of all yeshivas, was in Valozhin. And at that time, the Rosh Yeshiva was the Nitziv, and his grandson by marriage was a Rosh Yeshiva, the Reb Chaim Brisker. And they could not convince Valozhin to allow the study of Musar in their yeshiva. And Rabbi Yisrael's Talmud, Rabbi Itzel of Petterberger, came as a shliach to represent Rabbi Yisrael to try to convince the Rosh Yeshiva in Valozhin to introduce Musar into the curriculum of the yeshiva. And he got a flat no, a refusal. And Reb Chaim explained why. And the Rav embellishes the words of Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim felt that Musar brings a person to a state of melancholy, of dark despair. In the yeshiva, the Musar circles, they would berate themselves. They would focus on their sins and their difficulties and their iniquities and their failures. And it was something that led to chas v'sholom, to depression and to melancholy. It was famous that in certain Musar yeshivas, on Shabbos night, when the lights went low, they would get themselves into a frenzy of despair. And Reb Chaim said this is antithetical to our yeshiva. And he gave the following mashal. He told Reb Itzel that if a person is suffering from difficult stomach diseases, you can give him castor oil and it will help him restore his health. But if a person is healthy and you give him castor oil, he'll get sick from it. Rav Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim, thank you, said, then in our yeshiva, Baruch Hashem, in Valozhin, we're all healthy. You want to give us Musar? You want to give us an agenda that's like giving castor oil to a healthy person who'll get sick from? And Rav Soloveitchik, in his halachic man, speaks about two types. Now, again, this is so typical of Rav Soloveitchik's application of the Brisker methodology to the world of Ashkaf. He speaks about there are two categories and classifications of relationship to the reality. One is called homo religioso, the man of religion. The other is the man of contemplation, of analysis, of science, of math. And they come with two different approaches to reality. The approach of the man of science is to try to define and classify every single phenomenon in nature and understand its essence, what causes it and what are the results of it. The homo religioso, on the other hand, is a man who's looking for the mysteries. He's asking the philosophical questions. And Rav Soloveitchik says that the halachic system of the halachic man is much more similar to the man of contemplation who analyzes every phenomenon in nature, comes under the scrutiny of the man of halacha. He brings his a priori concepts and his definitions, and he sees whether the reality could fit into those abstract definitions. For example, a mayon, a spring. What are the dimensions of the spring? And there are a whole list of halachic considerations that will be determined by this investigation of the nature of the spring. But the homo religioso brings himself into psychic states of ecstasy, looking for that mysterious higher world. And that's antithetical to halacha. Halacha wants to take God and bring him down into this world. The Torah tells us that the Shekhinah came down to Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. The homo religioso, on the other hand, wants to take this world and bring it up to a higher world, to a world of mystery. And the Rav Zichron Livracha, time after time, would speak out against what he called religious subjectivism. When a person brings himself to a frenzy, he said, not that the halachic man has no feelings about the Torah and implementing the Torah, but it's a different kind of emotional response. It's the understanding of the halach that brings a person into that state of ecstasy and happiness and joy. It's a very profound kind of joy because it's a result of his intellectual analysis of the mitzvahs. And the Rav told us a story about his father, Rav Moshe, who once, in the city of Chaslavich, which was a Lubavitcher town where he was the Rav, and it was time to blow the shofar, and Rav Moshe says, Tkiya, he was the Makri, and the blower broke down in tears, and he couldn't blow the shofar. So Rav Moshe got angry at him. He says that when you take a lulav, do you break down and cry before you take a lulav? From Rav Moshe's perspective, forget about your religious subjectivism, your subjective feelings, and the deep meaning on a mystical level of what a shofar is all about. And a kol shofar, it's a kol pashut. No, leave that all out. The Torah commands you to blow the shofar, and that's what you have to do. Reb Chaim was opposed to Musar because he felt that Musar, the way it was practiced originally, back in the day, was much more similar to homo religioso, and it had to be rejected by Judaism. The Rav points out that later on, the Musar movement took a different turn, especially with the Alter of Slobodka, Nosson Finkel, and it introduced security, self-confidence, joy. You know, the Alter of Slobodka didn't talk about yeshiva bachrim like we talk about them today. In his language, it was the yeshiva man, because the whole purpose was to build up the yeshiva man when he was downtrodden. I'm looking at my watch to see, we don't have much time, but if you can give me 5 more minutes, I want to talk about sensitivity, moral sensitivity. Rav Soloveitchik never stopped talking about sensitivity, and so many stories about he personally in his life reflect that sensitivity. The Rambam writes that on Purim, if you have limited funds, and you have 3 mitzvahs, you have the mitzvah of Sudas Purim, you have the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos, Ish L'Re'eu, you have a mitzvah of Matanos Levyonim, where should you put the emphasis? And the Rambam writes, spend the money on Matanos Levyonim. That should be first priority. Why? Because Ein Simcha Kis Simchas Ha'ani. Hamlolim, those who are downtrodden. And Rav Soloveitchik asked the obvious question. We talk about the mitzvahs of Purim now. And you want to classify which mitzvah of Purim, Sudas Purim, Mishloach Manos, which is primary. And the Rav asked, why does the Rambam focus his attention on the Simcha of the Ani? And he broke new ground by telling us all these 3 mitzvahs are really one mitzvah. The Chazal established Purim as a day of Simcha. How do we achieve that Simcha? Through Suda, by giving Matanos L'Re'eu, and by giving Matanos L'Avyonim. So they're all part of one entity called Simcha, and the greatest Simcha is the Simcha of the Aniyim, and that's why it gets priority. Rav Soloveitchik spoke about what's called Inui Almana. The Gemara tells us that when they took Rabbi Yishmael out, he was one of the Arugei Malchus, one of the martyrs, and they were about to decapitate him, and he started crying, and his colleagues asked him, "Why are you crying? In a few seconds you'll be in Olam Haba." He says, "I'm not crying about death. I'm crying about the way I'm being killed, because the Torah tells us that if you afflict an almana, then you will be killed b'cherev. And possibly I afflicted an almana." What does that mean? So the Medrash explains that perhaps on one occasion, Rabbi Yishmael came back after a very heavy day, working on behalf of the Jewish community, selflessness. Always, every moment. And maybe a woman came by to ask a question, and she was an almana, she was a widow. So the Shamish came to the door, and he said, "I can't disturb my Rebbi because he's resting now." And she shed a tear. And the thought crossed her mind that if my husband was alive, then the Rebbi would have come out personally to answer my question. Rav Soloveitchik had a student from Boston by the name of Ezra. And unfortunately, at the age of 16, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. He was a student, Maimonides, and Rav Soloveitchik used to call all the time to find out how he's doing. When the boy reached the age of 20, he came to New York to study under Rav Soloveitchik in his class, in his Talmud class. And Rav Soloveitchik was the only person in the entire room who knew how dangerously ill Ezra was. No one knew that he had to go for all these treatments. On one particular day, Ezra mentioned to Rav Soloveitchik that he has to leave Shir early because of the treatment that he has to go for. Rav Soloveitchik canceled the end of the class. He told everyone to go home. He didn't want Ezra to feel any sense of embarrassment. I don't know if you know Rabbi Kenny Brander. Originally, he was the Rav in Boca Raton. Now he's here on Aliyah, Baruch Hashem. And he was the Mashamesh of Rav Soloveitchik for a number of years. And he tells the story that on one occasion he was about to leave the apartment to go out and meet a young lady who turned out later on to be his wife. And he was going out on a date. And the Rav looked at his feet and he was wearing sneakers and white socks. So Rav Soloveitchik said to him, "That's not the way you go out to meet a young lady. You should put on dress shoes." So Kenny says to Rav Soloveitchik, "Don't worry about it. You know, we've gotten past that. Our relationship is more developed." The Rav said, No. So then Kenny said to him, "But I'm wearing white socks. I can't wear white socks with dress shoes." So Rav Soloveitchik took him over to his drawer, opened the drawer, he says, pick a pair of socks. Rav Soloveitchik never wore dark socks. He only wore white socks. So Kenny, out of curiosity, said, "Rebbi, you always wear white socks. How come you have this a myriad supply of black socks, and you don't wear them?" So Rav Soloveitchik explained that when his Rebbitzin had lymphobia, she was ill. It's hard for her to see. And when she was washing the socks, Rav Soloveitchik wanted to spare her of the difficulty of pairing black socks. You know, black socks look very similar to each other. You know, you have to really see very carefully the different patterns. So in order to spare her that feeling that she didn't know how to pair the socks, he wore white socks. The sensitivity. All of Judaism is about sensitivity. And Rav Soloveitchik taught us that wherever we turn, we have to have a sense of closeness, of unity. Rav Soloveitchik used to talk about the Mishnah in Bava Kama says that if you hurt somebody, then you have to ask him for mechila. But almost an identical Mishnah appears at the end of Yoma, and there it says, Ad sheyiratzes chaver. So Rav Soloveitchik asked, in one Mishnah it says you have to ask for mechila, and in the other Mishnah it says, Ad sheyiratze, you need ritzui. And he said that that's the difference between the whole year round and Yom Kippur. The Mishnah in Bava Kama, which addresses the whole year round, then if you want to clean your record, you need bakashas mechila, get mechila. But on Yom Kippur, bakashas mechila is not enough. You need ritzu. You have to reestablish that close relationship that you once had before the insult. Because on Yom Kippur, we come in front of the Rebbeinu Shalom as a unity, as an entity, as a tzibur. And that's why Yom Kippur is called a Yom Tzom. The word Tzom in Lashon Kodesh means Soma, a braid. We come braided together. We are all one. And we're matir to be davening with the Avaryonim like the Chelben and the Ketoras. In Ritz Hashem, in a week from today, I'd like to discuss with you the three great giants of ethics that we've spoken about in the last couple of weeks. Rabbi SALANTER, the Busa movement, Rav Nosson, STERNHARZ, and the Hasidic movement, and now Rav Soloveitchik. And perhaps we can put things into perspective and see, first of all, an overview of each of the three, and then compare and contrast it. I want to just end the share again by thanking everyone for coming and joining me tonight. And also, I want to wish that tonight's shir should be Le'ili Nishmas HaRebbi, Morenu for Rabbeinu. I have to tell you, I was only in the shir for 5 years, but in the shir, you worked up seniority, so you could move closer and closer to the Rav. And in the last 2 years, I was able to sit right next to the Rav. And what was the most amazing thing? The Rav was a very dramatic speaker, very clear, crystal clear and analytic. But for me, getting close to the table, the most amazing thing was watching the Rav's legs. It was unbelievable. It was kol atzmos termano. His whole body moved with the Torah, and his legs would go up and down in a rhythm that reflected the Torah that he was teaching. Yehi Zechro Baruch, we should be zocheh to learn his Torah, to be elevated by his Torah, and he to elevate us from Olam Haba. If anyone wants to stay for questions, now's a good time.
Rabbi, I just wanted to, with your permission, I just wanted to make a comment. We were privileged to, without any foreplanning, to own a home right across the narrow street from Rabbi Soloveitchik and his wife. And we were a young family moving into Brookline. We had little kids, and we had a new dog in the family. The Rav would walk to the mailbox on the corner to mail letters. And one Sunday afternoon, that wasn't Sunday, it was a Monday, my wife says, "Oh, quick, get across the street to the mailbox. Our dog is attacking the Rav." And our dog was a Norwegian Elkhound, which was a medium-sized dog, and a young one, Frisky. And the Rav was wearing a long robe, and the dog was pulling at the robe. So I ran across and got the dog away. And before I could do anything to apologize to the Rav, he bends down and pets the dog, and he says, "Nice doggy." That was the neshama of that man. I mean, just remarkable.
The Rav, was a split personality in this sense. In shir, in class, he was brutal. He, is very hard to live up to his standards. And he used to call on people to read the Gemara, and within seconds he knew whether or not you understood the Gemara. So people were afraid to read the Gemara. And when he took the attendance, which he did on a daily basis, and he got to the name Schwartz, so Schwartz says he didn't come to it. So the Rav said to him, "All right, you read the Gemara." And I remember a friend of ours, David Hornung, he's about 6'4". He tried to hide. The Rav loved his name. Every time he called him in the roll call, Hornung, he used to sing it. My name, he never got straight. Never got it straight. He used to call me Azarya. So finally, after 5 years, I got the guts up. I said, "Rebbi, my name is not Azarya, it's Azarya." "Oh, you mean like Rabbi Joseph B Azarya?" I said, "Yeah, you got it." The next day, of course, he called me Azarya. But I was always thankful that he came from Boston to marry us off. My wife is here. Before we got married, I took my wife to meet him, and he spent almost a half hour with us. Who was waiting outside was Rav Goren. He was the chief rabbi of Israel at that time. But the Rav didn't care. He wanted to spend time with a Talmud of his and his fiancée. When we walked out, my wife turns to me and she says, "This is Rav Soloveitchik that you're so afraid of? He's like a Zayda." It was a split personality. Outside of Shir, it was a whole different story. He was like, your best friend. But in Shir, so I'll just end with one more story. This story I heard when I was sitting Shir with my father. When I was in stitches, I was laughing. Rabbi Tabori, Zichrono Levracha, who's Mashgiach in Gush, came to me, and he said to me, we were sitting in the Rav Shir. In the first row, Rav Shechter was sitting, Rav Hershel Shechter, and behind him was Rav David Mill, and I was in the third row. That's what Tabori tells me. The Rav is looking for someone to read the Gemara. You knew that he was going to put you over the coals. So just at that second, the Rav is looking at Rav Shechter. Rav Shechter's pen fell. So Rav Shechter leans over, and the Rav is looking at Rabbi Miller, David Miller. So David Miller starts leaning over like this, and now he's looking at Tabori. So Tabori goes like this. So the Rav says, what is it, bowling pins today?